It all started because my husband, the Alpha King, has the emotional intelligence of a well-meaning golden retriever who has just been handed a scepter and told to manage fiscal policy. I was elbow-deep in sourdough when he appeared in the kitchen doorway, rain-soaked and wind-bitten, holding something against his chest. His patrol cloak was muddy, his boots were tracking half the northern forest across my clean flagstones, and his expression was the one he wore when he'd done something he already knew I was going to have an opinion about. "Before you say anything," he began. The something in his arms squirmed. A small, black, furry head emerged from the folds of his cloak. It had ears that flopped at asymmetrical angles and paws far too big for its body. It blinked at me with dark, liquid eyes, then let out a sound that was either a sneeze or a declaration of war. Hard to tell with wolf pups. "Absolutely not," Antonio said before I could speak. "I am not keeping it. I found it shivering under a supply cart near an abandoned camp on the northern border. It was alone. No dam, no pack scent, nothing. I brought it back because it would have died, and I will find it a suitable home elsewhere. It is not staying in the palace." He said all of this while the wolf pup chewed contentedly on the collar of his cloak, a thread of drool connecting its tiny mouth to the king's ceremonial fastening. "The pup is undersized," my wolf observed from somewhere in the back of my mind, her voice carrying the clinical detachment of a field surgeon assessing a sprained ankle. "Approximately 8 weeks. No signs of malnourishment. Likely separated from its dam recently. The alpha's cloak, however, is a total loss." I wiped the flour from my hands and crossed the kitchen. Antonio, who could stare down a rogue alpha twice his size without blinking, took a half step back. "You're not keeping it," he repeated, less certainly. I reached out and took the pup from his arms. It weighed almost nothing. It was warm and slightly damp, and it smelled like wet fur and pine needles, and something else, something clean and simple that I couldn't name. The pup looked up at me, considered the situation with a gravity that seemed excessive for a creature that could fit inside a bread bowl, and then tucked its head firmly under my chin and sighed. Something in my chest cracked open. Not broke. Cracked open, the way a seed does. I had been very carefully not thinking about certain things for several months. I had been carefully not looking at the nursery wing when I walked past it. I had been carefully smiling when visiting dignitaries asked, as they always did, when the kingdom might expect an heir. I had been carefully not noticing the way Antonio's hand would sometimes drift to the flat of my stomach when he thought I was asleep, and then pull away, as if he'd caught himself hoping. We had been trying. It had not happened. Neither of us talked about it. And now there was this warm, small, breathing weight tucked under my chin, needing nothing from me except to be held. I was not going to think about why that felt like oxygen. "His name is Crumpet," I said. Antonio stared at me. "Tilly, we are not." "His name," I said in a voice I usually reserved for bread that refused to rise, "is Crumpet. He is staying." Crumpet, as if to formalize the arrangement, wriggled out of my arms, dropped to the floor, trotted 3 paces, and sat firmly on my foot. He looked up at me with an expression of profound and immediate loyalty. Then he looked at Antonio, the formidable 6'4" Alpha King Antonio Wolfson of the Blackwood Pack, the Wolf of the North, the man who once intimidated a mountain lion into apologizing and let out a growl. It sounded like a bee trapped in a thimble. "The pup has established territorial priority over the queen's left foot," my wolf noted. "This is procedurally unusual, but not without precedent. His growl requires significant development. Current threat level, negligible." Antonio looked at the tiny wolf pup growling at him from the top of my shoe. He looked at me. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "He just growled at me," he said, in the tone of a man whose worldview has suffered a hairline fracture. "In my own castle. He's protecting me." "From what? I'm his king." Crumpet growled again, just to clarify his position. Then he sneezed, which rather undermined the effect. Antonio flinched anyway. I picked Crumpet up, set him on my hip like a flour-dusted infant, and went back to my sourdough. "He stays." Behind me, I heard my husband, ruler of the Blackwood pack, make a small, defeated sound. His wolf, a being I could occasionally feel through the mate bond, pure, uncut enthusiasm and competitive zeal compressed into psychic form, was already forming a plan. The small one does not recognize our authority. This is a temporary setback. We will win him. We are the supreme alpha. He will love us. It was going to be a very, very long week. The first thing I learned about Crumpet was that he did not merely prefer me, he was magnetically, gravitationally, almost religiously devoted to me. If I sat, he sat on my foot. If I walked, he trotted 3 inches behind my left ankle with the focused intensity of a tiny, furry honor guard. If I baked, which was most of the day, because I was the queen and I ran these kitchens and no one, not even the head chef who had been here 30 years before me, was going to tell me otherwise, Crumpet positioned himself under the prep table and watched the flour drift down like snow, occasionally snapping at a falling piece with the earnest futility of a pup who had not yet learned that flour was not edible prey. The second thing I learned was that he hated my husband. Hate is a strong word, Antonio said at breakfast the next morning, watching Crumpet eat toast from my fingers while ignoring the bowl of diced rabbit Antonio had carefully prepared. He literally turns his back to you and presses closer to my leg when you enter a room. He's adjusting. He's been through trauma. He needs time. The alpha is rationalizing, my wolf observed with the cool detachment of a therapist. Denial, bargaining. The pup simply does not like him. This is not complicated. We shifted at dawn that morning, as we did most mornings. It was our ritual, the one part of the day where neither of us carried anything. The shift itself was a relief I never got used to. The world cracked open. Smell first, always smell. A wall of information so dense it was almost a physical texture. The wet earth, the frost on the grass, the deer that had crossed the northern meadow an hour ago, 2 does and a yearling moving east. The pine sap bleeding from the tree Antonio had marked last week, his scent post still sharp and territorial. All of it arrived in the first breath, and the human part of me, the part that worried and waited and lay awake at night counting the things I couldn't control, went quiet. Antonio's wolf was enormous and dark, built like a siege weapon with surprisingly soft eyes. Mine was smaller, tawny, quicker in the turns. We ran the eastern ridge, where the forest floor was soft with needles, looped through the birch stands where the light came down in silver columns. And for 30 minutes the only thought in my head was the placement of each paw, the rhythm of our breathing, the particular rightness of running beside a body that matched mine, stride for stride. He bumped his shoulder against mine as we crested the ridge, a wolf gesture that meant something like, "I'm here," and "I'm yours, and this is good." And I bumped him back, and we ran faster, and the world was nothing but motion and cold air and the 2 of us, whole. When we returned to the palace, still settling back into human form, that particular few seconds of re-entry where the world is too loud and your skin feels like a borrowed coat, Crumpet was waiting by the kitchen door. He had somehow escaped the basket I'd left him in, navigated 2 corridors and a staircase, and was sitting in the exact spot where he'd last seen me, vibrating with indignation. He took one look at Antonio, who was still shaking pine needles out of his hair and pulling on his shirt, and let out the most withering growl his small body could produce. "He's getting louder," Antonio said glumly. "He missed me," I said, scooping Crumpet up. He buried his face in my neck and made a sound like a very small engine of contentment. "He didn't miss me," Antonio pointed out. Observation. Correct, my wolf confirmed. The palace staff, who had the collective emotional intelligence of a pack of wolves who had also been raised by gossips, noticed the dynamic within 48 hours. By the 3rd day, Antonio's beta, Marcus Thorne, had organized a formal betting pool. Marcus was the operational center of the pack, calm, competent, and possessed of a ruthless efficiency that he applied to logistics, diplomacy, and recreational cruelty toward his alpha in exactly equal measure. The betting pool was run from a leather-bound ledger he carried at all times, with categories including, will the king achieve a tail wag? Current odds 8-1. What will the pup destroy next? And the premium tier wager, Will the king cry in public? This is insubordination, Antonio told him. This is morale building, my king, Marcus replied serenely, making a notation in his ledger. The first official campaign in what the palace staff was now calling Operation Win the Growl began with a squeaky toy. It was not just any squeaky toy. It was a custom-commissioned, hand-stitched leather squirrel filled with organic catnip-infused wool, a suggestion from a visiting dignitary who owned cats and was clearly a saboteur. And its squeaker was tuned to a frequency that, according to the royal artisan, was irresistible to the canine heart. Antonio presented it with the gravity of a king offering a treaty. He knelt on the polished marble floor of the great hall, a place where he normally only knelt to be coronated or to propose to me, and held out the squirrel. For you, little one, he said, his voice a low, hopeful rumble. Crumpet, who had been diligently attempting to untie my shoelace from his post on my foot, paused. He lifted his head, his floppy ears twitched. He looked at the squirrel, he looked at the king. Antonio's wolf screamed across the mate bond, a psychic blast of pure triumph I could feel from 10 feet away. Victory is at hand! He likes the squirrel! We are the supreme alpha of gift-giving! Crumpet trotted over to the offering. He gave the leather squirrel a delicate sniff. Then he lifted his leg and peed on it. It was not a large amount of pee. It was a tiny, defiant, symbolic stream. But it was enough. The squeak it made as the liquid hit the toy's internal mechanism was less a squeak of delight and more a wet, gurgling sigh of defeat. Then, his point made, Crumpet trotted back to me and once again sat on my foot, looking up at me with an expression of profound and righteous accomplishment. There was a moment of perfect, echoing silence in the great hall. Then one of the guards made a sound like a choked goose. Antonio remained kneeling, staring at the damp squirrel as if it held the secrets to his own damnation. The human has failed, his wolf declared, the psychic triumph now a sulky mutter. I specifically instructed him to approach from downwind. This is a tactical disaster. Well, I said into the silence, because someone had to. He's certainly claimed it. Marcus Thorne strode into the hall, ledger tucked under his arm. He took in the scene, the kneeling king, the damp squirrel, me holding the victor, and a slow grin spread across his face. He made a neat tick mark in his ledger. That's another 10 silver for the humiliating rejection column, he announced cheerfully. The odds on you ever getting a cuddle just went to 20-1, my king. Antonio groaned and let his head fall into his hands. That night, I found him in the courtyard behind the armory, pacing in wolf form. He'd shifted without telling me, which meant he was genuinely upset. His wolf, massive, dark-furred, built like something that ended arguments by entering rooms, was running the perimeter wall in tight, agitated loops. I leaned against the doorframe and watched. The moonlight caught the silver in his fur, the places where his coat had lightened over the years. He was beautiful and ridiculous, and he was running laps because a 10-pound wolf pup had peed on his present. He is processing, my wolf noted. This is healthy coping behavior. However, the 6th lap is excessive, suggesting he vary his route to avoid repetitive stress on the left hind joint. You know he can't hear your suggestions, I murmured. She ignored me, which was her preferred mode of engagement. Antonio eventually shifted back, pulled on the trousers he'd left folded on a bench, and came to stand beside me. He smelled like night air and exertion and himself, underneath whatever soap he used that made everything smell like a forest. I didn't want him, he said, staring at the wall he'd been running along. I know. And now he doesn't want me, and it's... He stopped, shook his head. It's stupid. It wasn't stupid, but I didn't say that. I just put my hand on his arm and stood there until the tension bled out of his shoulders. Antonio's second campaign involved food. Specifically, a cut of venison so rare and prized, it was normally reserved for the pack's most honored elders on the winter solstice. He had the royal chefs sear it for exactly 10 seconds on each side, slice it into bite-sized, pup-friendly pieces, and serve it on a miniature silver platter. He was leveraging millennia of alpha proffering food instinct. He set the platter down in my private sitting room, where I was attempting to read a book on crop rotation while Crumpet chewed thoughtfully on the corner of the rug. "A morsel to tempt you," Antonio declared, his voice full of forced confidence. His wolf was giving him a running pep talk. "Food is the pathway to loyalty. He is small. His stomach is the size of a walnut. We will conquer him with protein." Crumpet stopped chewing the rug. He sniffed the air. He followed the scent to the silver platter. He looked at Antonio, who was holding his breath from 15 feet away, trying to appear non-threatening. Crumpet then looked at me, a clear question in his dark eyes. I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. My role in this was to be Switzerland, but a Switzerland that occasionally sanctioned invasions if they were cute enough. He ate the entire platter of priceless venison with the single-minded focus of a creature who had never known such luxury. When he was done, he licked the platter clean, gave a small, satisfied burp, and trotted over to the chaise lounge. He circled it twice and fell into a deep meat coma sleep. He had not once looked at Antonio. He had not offered a tail wag, a grateful glance, or even a brief cessation of his low-level ambient suspicion. He had simply accepted the tribute as his due. "Progress?" Antonio asked, his voice tight with hope. "He accepted your offering," I said carefully, choosing my words as if diffusing a bomb. "That is a step." He didn't even acknowledge me. He treated me like a food delivery service. "The pup has consumed the resources," my wolf observed. "He has provided no reciprocal gesture of submission or gratitude. This is a power play. The pup is a political genius." "Perhaps he's a slow burn," I offered. "His affections must be earned through consistent, unrewarded servitude, like a cat." Antonio began pacing. "I am not a servant. I am his king, and his alpha by marriage. He should show me respect." Crumpet, in his sleep, let out a soft little snore and kicked his back legs, dreaming of chasing glimmer moths, the iridescent insects that flitted through the castle halls and which he found endlessly, hilariously fascinating. That night, as I'd predicted, Crumpet curled up on Antonio's pillow. Every time my husband moved, a low growl, like the hum of a disgruntled hornet, would emanate from the pillow. Antonio lay ramrod straight, staring at the canopy above our bed. "I can feel him watching me," he whispered into the darkness. I was already half asleep. "He's asleep, Antonio." "He's watching me with his mind growls, Tilly." "His paranoia is escalating," my wolf noted, suggesting a mild sedative. "For the alpha." "Just try to think of it as a security feature," I murmured. He made a wounded sound. In the dark, with Crumpet's tiny warmth radiating from Antonio's pillow, and my husband lying rigid beside me, the silence grew a second layer. The one we didn't talk about. The one where a different, small, warm body was supposed to be. I curled onto my side and pressed my face into Antonio's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around me without a word. And we lay like that, the three of us in a bed meant for the start of a family. And I tried very hard not to feel like a woman, waiting for something that might never come. The betting pool, under Marcus's gleeful management, expanded. New categories were added daily. What will the pup destroy next? Which diplomat will the pup scandalize? And the high stakes, will the king cry in public? I pretended to disapprove, but I had quietly put 5 silver on Crumpet interrupting a council of elders meeting. It felt like a safe bet. I was right. The scene in the council chamber was one of controlled chaos. The 12 elders, the most powerful and somber wolves in the kingdom, were seated around the great oak table. And in the center of that table, prancing proudly with his tail held high, was Crumpet. He was carrying something in his mouth, something large, white, and lacy. It was a pair of Antonio's ceremonial undergarments, the ones reserved for the most sacred of moon rituals, the ones I had just laid out for him that morning. He trotted right up to the head of the table, dropped the silken drawers directly in front of Elder Maeve, the pack's formidable matriarch, and looked at her expectantly, as if presenting a freshly caught rabbit. Maeve, a woman who hadn't smiled since the last ice age, stared at the undergarments. She looked at Antonio, whose face had gone a color I could only describe as apoplectic beige. She looked at me. Then she looked back at the pup. A strange, unfamiliar twitch pulled at the corner of her mouth. It was a smile. A genuine, honest-to-God's smile. "Well, Alpha," she said, her voice raspy with disuse, "it seems the little one believes your unmentionables are a matter for public discussion." Antonio, to his credit, handled it with the composure of a man who had nothing left to lose. He walked to the table, retrieved his sacred undergarments from in front of the pack's most revered elder, tucked them under his arm with as much dignity as a person can tuck undergarments, and said, "If we could return to the matter of grain tariffs." No one could return to the matter of grain tariffs. Elder Maeve was still smiling. One of the younger council members had his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Marcus, who had appeared in the doorway at exactly the right moment, as he always did, was making rapid, gleeful notations in his ledger. I collected my 5 silver from Marcus later that afternoon. He paid it with a look of genuine respect. "You know your pup, Your Grace." "I know chaos when I see it, Marcus. I married it." The betting pool was going to need a whole new category: acts of God-tier humiliation. That afternoon I shifted alone. I needed it. That particular itch under the skin that meant I'd been human too long, had been holding my shape like holding my breath. I slipped out the kitchen door and into the castle gardens, found a private spot behind the wisteria wall, and let go. The shift was a relief, the way putting down something heavy is a relief. In wolf form, the garden was a different country. The rosemary was a green shout. The soil under the flagstones hummed with moisture. The lavender my gardener had planted last season was a soft, purple wall of scent that I walked through like a curtain. I was lying in a patch of sun near the herb beds, just breathing, when a familiar small shape appeared at the garden gate. Crumpet had escaped again. He stood at the gate, his head cocked, staring at my wolf form. He had never seen me shifted. I went still. My wolf held herself carefully, making herself small, non-threatening. The pup approached. His nose worked overtime, sniffing the air between us in rapid, shallow pulls. He knew it was me, the scent told him. But the shape was wrong, and for a long moment he just stood there, processing. Then he did something that made my wolf's analytical brain stutter. He walked straight up to me, pushed his small body against my side, and settled in. No hesitation, no growl. Just a small wolf pressing into a larger one, claiming warmth. "The pup recognizes our scent across forms," my wolf noted. And for the first time I heard something in her voice that was not clinical. It was gentle. "He trusts us entirely." I curled around him and we lay in the sun for a long time, 2 wolves in a garden, and I did not think about nursery wings or the things my body had not yet done. I thought about nothing at all. It was the best I'd felt in weeks. Antonio, meanwhile, had moved from bribery to psychoanalysis. He was convinced Crumpet's rejection stemmed from deep-seated trauma. "He was abandoned, Tilly," he explained earnestly over breakfast, while Crumpet took small bites of toast directly from my fingers and ignored the imported elk sausage Antonio had commissioned. "He fears attachment. He pushes away those who would love him most as a defense mechanism." "The alpha is projecting his own abandonment issues onto the pup," my wolf observed with the cool detachment of a licensed professional. "This is textbook. He owes me 50 silver. "Or," I said, wiping crumbs from my fingers, "he just thinks you're loud." Antonio deflated. "I am not loud. I am authoritative. My voice commands respect." As if on cue, Crumpet let out a tiny yip and scrabbled at the kitchen door. I let him out into the gardens, and he shot out like a furry cannonball, chasing after a glimmer moth that was fluttering near my rose bushes. He was pure, unadulterated joy. Antonio watched him go, a wistful, heartbroken look on his face. He truly was a giant golden retriever of a man, a sad, rejected golden retriever. "You didn't want him," I reminded him gently. 3 days ago you said he couldn't stay. That was before he chose you over me, Antonio said, as if this were obvious. Now it's personal. Antonio's third campaign was the Sunstone Tart. It was my creation, a notoriously difficult pastry requiring 3 days of prep, a dough laminated with frozen butter 27 times, and a filling of sun-ripened apricots cooked down so slowly it was more meditation than recipe. It was a test of patience. It was my therapy. On the second day, as I was performing the 15th fold of the dough, Antonio entered my kitchen. He didn't speak. He just leaned against the doorframe and watched. Crumpet was asleep in his basket by the hearth, a tiny twitching lump of fur. The silence was comfortable, filled with the soft sounds of my work. He still won't let me touch him, Antonio said finally. His voice was soft. It wasn't a complaint. It was a statement of fact, a weary admission. I know, I said, not looking up from the dough. It's not you, Antonio. I don't think it's personal. It feels personal. He was quiet for a moment. He looks at you like you hung the moon. He looks at me like I'm something he'd like to bury in the yard. This was it, one of those rare moments where the king stepped aside and my husband appeared. The man underneath the crown, the one who worried and felt small things deeply. When he looks at you, he said, his voice thick, I see the way my own wolf felt the first time I saw you. Like the whole world just snapped into focus. And I'm on the outside of it. He paused. And it looks like the thing I've been wanting, He stopped himself. But I knew what he'd almost said. The family. My hands stilled on the dough. Antonio, I know we don't talk about it. We should, I said, very quietly. There's nothing to talk about. It'll happen when it happens. The healers said to be patient, and I am patient. I dusted the marble slab with flour, a precise, controlled gesture. I am patient every month. I am patient when someone asks about an heir. I am patient when your hand moves to my stomach in the dark and then moves away again, as if you don't want me to know you're hoping. The kitchen was very quiet. Crumpet snored softly in his basket. I didn't know you were awake for that, he whispered. Every time. He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and wrapped his arms around me from behind, flour and all. I leaned back into him, his chest solid against my back, his chin on my head, his heartbeat steady against my spine. We stood like that, swaying slightly, like 2 people slow dancing in a kitchen that smelled like butter and yeast. You are enough, he said into my hair. You know that. You are enough without any of it. So are you, I said. Even if a wolf pup the size of a bread loaf thinks you're a monster. He laughed, and it was a real laugh, low and warm and slightly broken at the edges. Then he kissed the top of my head and held me tighter, and for a few minutes the ache was just an ache, not a howl. Crumpet woke up, yawned hugely, and scrabbled out of his basket. He trotted over and sat on my foot, pressing himself against both our legs. A tiny, furry bridge between 2 people who were trying very hard to be brave about something they couldn't control. The bond is resonating, my wolf murmured, her voice softer than I had ever heard it. The pack structure is intact. This is enough. Later that afternoon, the Sunstone Tart was cooling on the rack, a perfect golden disc of flaky pastry and shimmering apricot. It was a masterpiece. Antonio appeared in the doorway with a hopeful look. He was going to use my power, my competence. I knew what he was planning. It was a terrible idea. But the look in his eyes was so pleading I couldn't refuse. I cut a small, perfect slice. He carried it like a holy relic into the sitting room, where Crumpet was batting at a loose thread on the curtains. A peace offering, Antonio announced, from Tilly's own hands, the finest pastry in the kingdom. Crumpet stopped his assault on the curtain. He trotted over. He sniffed the tart, and his whole body leaned into the scent. It was the smell of my kitchen, my hands, my hours of patient work. He knew who this belonged to. He looked at the tart, he looked at Antonio. Then, with a deliberation that was almost human, he placed one fuzzy paw on the edge of the plate and pushed. It slid across the polished floor and tipped over, landing face down with a soft, tragic splat. But he didn't walk away. Instead, Crumpet looked at me, standing in the doorway behind Antonio, and let out a single, pointed bark. Then he trotted past Antonio, around the ruined tart, and sat at my feet. The message was lethally clear. That was hers, not yours to give. Antonio stared at the ruined tart. His wolf let out a howl of psychic agony. The pastry gambit has failed! I repeat, the pastry gambit has failed! Abandon all hope! I sighed and went to get a cloth. He's not rejecting the tart, he's rejecting you as the delivery mechanism. That's worse, Tilly. That's objectively worse. That evening, something changed. Neither of us planned it. We were both tired, him from a day of governance and public humiliation, me from 3 days of laminated dough and the emotional weight of a conversation we'd been carrying for months. Without discussing it, we both shifted. It happened naturally the way it does when you've been mated long enough. I felt the pull, he felt the pull, and within a few minutes we were both in wolf form, lying on the thick sheepskin rug in front of the hearth in our private sitting room. His wolf, dark, massive, the size of a small horse, lay with his head on his paws. Mine curled beside him, our fur barely touching. In wolf form, the world was simpler. Not easier, simpler. The fire was warm, the sheepskin was soft. The mate beside me was mine and I was his, and that was the whole of it. No airs, no expectations, no careful silence, just warmth. Crumpet appeared in the doorway. He had never seen us both shifted at the same time. He stood very still, his ears rotating like small, confused satellite dishes. He knew our scents, but 2 enormous wolves where his humans used to be was clearly a conceptual challenge. He approached me first, of course, sniffed my muzzle, pressed his small body against my side. Familiar territory. Then, cautiously, one paw at a time, as if crossing a frozen lake, he moved toward Antonio. Antonio's wolf held absolutely still. No psychic screaming, no competitive zeal, just a massive dark wolf lying very, very quietly, barely breathing, chin flat on the rug, making himself as small as a creature his size could manage. Which was not very small. But the effort was visible, and it was everything. The pup sniffed the fur along his jaw, along the thick ruff of his neck where the scent was strongest. In wolf form, Antonio didn't smell like soap. He smelled like himself, earth and musk and something warm and steady that had nothing to do with cedar or oatmeal or any human invention. He smelled like a wolf. Crumpet didn't growl. He stood there for a long moment, nose working, processing whatever information his wolf senses were gathering. Then he turned, walked to the exact center of the space between us, and lay down. He was touching both of us, his back against my belly, one paw resting on Antonio's foreleg. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The pup has voluntarily entered shared space with the alpha's wolf form, my wolf noted, her voice almost reverent. This is significant. Do not move. Do not do anything. We stay like this until he decides otherwise. We stayed like that for over an hour. The fire cracked and settled. Crumpet's breathing slowed into sleep, his small body rising and falling between 2 wolves who would, at that moment, have fought the entire world to keep him exactly where he was. It was a beginning. Not the kind Antonio wanted. No tail wag, no lick, no joyful recognition. But it was the first time the 3 of us had been in the same space without tension, without growling, without the pup choosing one of us over the other. In the morning, back in human form, Antonio would try again, and Crumpet would growl again, and the war would resume. But I would remember this. The firelight on their fur, the small paw on my husband's foreleg, the silence that, for once, held nothing but peace. The observation that changed everything happened on a Tuesday. It didn't arrive as a revelation. It arrived the way most important things arrive in a kitchen, slowly, through repetition, through paying attention to what your hands and your nose are telling you. I was kneading dough, rye this time, a dense and forgiving loaf that didn't require precision so much as strength, when Crumpet did the thing he always did. He pressed his face into the fold of my apron and breathed in, deeply, with the full body commitment of a creature for whom scent was the primary language. He did this constantly, my apron, my flour-dusted sleeves, the breadcloths drying by the hearth, the sourdough starter I kept in a ceramic crock by the window. Anything that smelled like my kitchen, Crumpet wanted his face in it. I had always assumed it was me he was drawn to, my scent, my warmth, me specifically. But that morning, watching him burrow into a clean apron that I hadn't even put on yet, one that was simply hanging on its hook near the ovens, carrying nothing but the ambient smell of the kitchen, I realized it wasn't me. It was the flour, the yeast, the warm, yeasty, golden smell of bread. I started paying closer attention. When I came to him straight from the bath, freshly scrubbed with no kitchen smell on me, his greeting was warm but not frantic. When I came to him after a morning of baking, dusted in flour and smelling of proofing dough, he lost his mind with joy. The variable wasn't me, it was what I smelled like. Which meant the variable with Antonio might not be Antonio either. The thought hit me like a cold splash of water mid-knead. I stopped, flour drifting from my knuckles, and stared at the pup. Hypothesis forming, my wolf stated, and I could feel her leaning forward in my mind, suddenly interested. Proceed. I ran an experiment. I took a clean kitchen towel, dusted it liberally with flour, and left it on the floor near Antonio's study door. Crumpet found it within 20 minutes and slept on it for 3 hours. I took one of Antonio's shirts, freshly worn, saturated with his scent, and left it in the same spot the next day. Crumpet sniffed it, backed up 2 paces, and growled at it until I removed it. Control established, my wolf confirmed. The variable is olfactory. The pup is responding to a specific scent component in the alpha's profile. This is proper science. I watched Crumpet with my husband for the next 2 days with new eyes. The growling wasn't constant. It was worst when Antonio leaned in close, when he knelt to offer something, when he bent down to try to pet him, when he was near enough for the pup to get a full, concentrated dose of his scent. From across the room, Crumpet tolerated him. Up close, he flinched. Something about the way Antonio smelled was wrong. "Marcus," I said that afternoon, finding the beta in his office, surrounded by ledgers that were not, for once, related to gambling. Where exactly did the patrol find Crumpet? He checked his records. Northern border, under a supply cart near an old camp. Cedar Ridge, I think they called it. Abandoned logging operation. Cedar, I repeated. The whole area reeks of it, apparently. Old lumber camp. They were harvesting cedar for building timber before the operation folded. I went to our bedchamber, to the washstand, to the carved wooden box where Antonio kept his soap. A block of imported, hand-milled, absurdly expensive soap that he had shipped from the southern provinces every quarter. It came wrapped in waxed linen with a seal on it, like a diplomatic document. He'd been using it since before we met, since before he was king, since his uncle had given him his first block and told him an alpha should smell like the forest he ruled. It was, effectively, his signature scent. The scent that lived in his skin, his clothes, his hair, his pillow. The scent I had fallen asleep breathing in for years. I picked it up and inhaled. Cedarwood. Rich, resinous, warm to a human nose. To a wolf pup who'd spent the first weeks of his life shivering under a cart in an abandoned cedar logging camp, alone, cold, surrounded by that smell from every direction, it would be something else entirely. It would be the smell of fear. The smell of before. The great war between the Alpha King and a 10-pound wolf pup was never about dominance, trauma, abandonment, or the fundamental rejection of royal authority. It was about soap. "No," said Antonio. "Yes," I said. "Absolutely not. No, it's too simple. It can't be soap. He has a deep-seated psychological aversion to my authority as an alpha male. He has a deep-seated psychological aversion to your toiletries." We were standing in our bedchamber. I was holding a bar of my own soap, a plain, unscented block of oatmeal and honey that I used in the kitchen because it didn't transfer flavor to the bread. It smelled like nothing much. Warm, mild, slightly sweet. The pup was found at an abandoned cedar lumber camp, I said, laying it out the way I laid out ingredients for a complex recipe. Methodical, irrefutable. He was alone, probably terrified. The overwhelming scent of that place, the scent he associates with being lost and cold and afraid, is cedar. Your soap, which you apply liberally and daily, is cedarwood. You smell like the worst day of his life. Antonio stared at me. He looked at his expensive soap. He looked at my plain soap. He looked back at me. This is a theory, he said. This is a fact. Wash with mine, right now, and if I'm wrong, I will personally commission you a new squeaky toy. The squeaky toy is a sore subject, Tilly. Wash. He washed. He protested the entire time. The oatmeal soap was beneath his station. It had no complexity. He was going to smell like a bakery. But he washed. He scrubbed his hands, his arms, his neck, every place the cedar oil had lived in his skin. When he emerged from the washroom, he smelled like nothing Crumpet had ever had reason to fear. He smelled, in fact, faintly like me. Like my kitchen. Like bread. I went to find the pup. He was in his usual spot, asleep under the prep table in the kitchen, curled around a stolen oven mitt. I carried him, still drowsy, to the sitting room where Antonio was waiting. Antonio sat on the floor. He didn't kneel, didn't present an offering, didn't announce his intentions. He just sat, cross-legged, hands in his lap, and waited. I set Crumpet down. The pup blinked, oriented himself, and looked at the large man sitting on his floor. His ears went back, the precursor to a growl. His body tensed. Then his nose twitched. He sniffed the air. Once, twice, a third time, deeper, his whole body leaning into it. No cedar. No sharp, resinous, terrifying forest camp smell. Just something warm. Something that smelled like bread and safety and the hands that fed him. Crumpet took a step forward. Then another. He reached Antonio's knee and sniffed it thoroughly. He sniffed his hand. He sniffed his wrist. Then he climbed into Antonio's lap, circled once, and lay down. Antonio didn't move. He didn't breathe. He sat perfectly still, his enormous hands hovering an inch above the tiny wolf pup who was, for the first time, voluntarily resting in his space. "Tilly," he whispered, his eyes shining. "Tilly, he's in my lap." "I can see that." He's not growling." "I can hear that." "What do I do?" "Nothing. Don't move. Don't speak in your kingly voice. Just sit there and smell like bread." He sat there for 45 minutes. I know because I timed it. His legs fell asleep. His back ached. He did not move once. Crumpet slept peacefully in the lap of the Alpha King, and Antonio looked down at him with an expression of such pure, radiant, bewildered joy that I had to leave the room before I started crying. Marcus appeared in the corridor, took one look at my face, and went pale. "He's in his lap," I said. Marcus stared at me. The pup is in the king's lap? Voluntarily? Without coercion or bribery?" "It was the soap." "The what?" "Cedar soap. Crumpet was found at a cedar lumber camp. The smell terrified him. Antonio stopped smelling like cedar. Problem solved." Marcus Thorne, beta of the Blackwood Pack, operational genius, and bookmaker extraordinaire, closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose. "I have 47 open bets," he said slowly, representing over 300 silver coins, wagered on the premise that the king's relationship with this animal was a fundamental test of his alpha identity. He opened his eyes. "And you're telling me it was soap?" "I'm telling you it was soap. The king is going to be insufferable about this." "He's going to be insufferable about this for years, Marcus." He sighed, opened his ledger, and drew a single heavy line through the entire page. The castle settled into a new kind of normal, a chaotic, wolf-pup-centric normal. Marcus, ever the administrator, formally closed the betting pool with a ceremony that involved him standing in the Great Hall and reading the final tallies aloud to anyone who would listen. Total wagers placed, 312 silver. Total categories created, 14, including the short-lived and deeply disrespectful, will the pup achieve a higher approval rating than the king? Current answer, yes, by a significant margin. Total dignity lost by the crown, incalculable. I'd like it noted, Antonio said from his throne, with Crumpet asleep in his lap, that I won. You changed soap, my king, Marcus replied. The pup won. Your wife won. The soap won. You are, at best, fourth in the chain of victory. Antonio looked at me for support. I was already laughing. Crumpet did not become a different animal overnight. He still preferred me. He still slept closest to my side of the bed. He still followed me with the gravitational devotion of a small, furry moon. But the growling stopped. Antonio could enter a room without triggering a tiny, indignant alarm system. He could sit near me without the pup treating him like an incoming threat. And on the fourth night after the great soap revelation, Crumpet climbed onto Antonio's lap while he was reading reports, and fell asleep there voluntarily. And my husband sat in that chair until midnight rather than disturb him. He had also, with a dignity I found deeply endearing, switched to the oatmeal soap permanently. He told Marcus it was for dermatological reasons. Marcus, who had seen the man weep over a squeaky toy, said nothing. The head of the household guard, who had lost 15 silver on the bet that Antonio would never achieve physical contact with the pup, asked me privately if I could teach him to bake. Not for a wolf, he clarified. My wife's been distant lately. I figure if it works on wild animals, it might work on her. I gave him my sourdough starter recipe and told him to stop wearing so much cologne. He looked at me like I'd handed him the meaning of life. My kitchens remained my sanctuary, but now they were often occupied by a king who had discovered a surprising interest in kneading dough, claiming it was good for his nerves. Mostly he just got flour on everything, overworked the dough until it was the consistency of a leather shoe, and watched me work with a quiet, happy smile on his face, while I quietly remade whatever he'd destroyed. He was terrible at baking. He was wonderful at being present. Crumpet dozed in his basket by the hearth, occasionally opening one eye to verify that I was still there, and that the large, bread-scented man was maintaining an appropriate distance. One morning, I woke to find Antonio already awake, propped up on one elbow, watching me. Crumpet was a warm lump against my back, snoring softly. "What is it?" I murmured, my voice thick with sleep. "Nothing, just watching my world." He reached out, tracing the line of my jaw. "Do you ever miss it? Your old life? The quiet?" I thought for a moment. My small bakery. The predictable rhythm of my days. It felt like a story about someone else. Sometimes I miss the quiet, I admitted, but I was alone in that quiet, Antonio. I'd rather have this chaos with you. He leaned in to kiss me, and from behind me came a low growl, the sound of a tiny, disgruntled engine turning over. We both froze. Crumpet hadn't even opened his eyes. Antonio pulled back, his face a portrait of betrayal. But we had a breakthrough. The soap. He was in my lap. I bit my lip to keep from laughing. I reached back and stroked Crumpet's fur. The growling subsided. "He says you're not to disturb me when I'm sleeping," I translated gravely. "He says you're still on probation." "I changed soap for him, Tilly. I gave up cedarwood. I smell like a scone. What more does he want?" Patience, humility, a formal written apology, possibly notarized. Crumpet yawned enormously without opening his eyes, displaying a set of tiny teeth and a tongue the color of a summer peach, and settled deeper into the blankets. Antonio flopped back against the pillows with a groan of theatrical despair. "I will never be fully approved, will I?" "No," I said, laying my head on his chest. "But he's willing to let me keep you anyway." He wrapped his arms around me. His wolf was sending out waves of pure, unadulterated happiness. My wolf noted, "The pack structure is secure. The sleeping arrangements are suboptimal but functional. I will allow it." It happened on a morning like any other. I was in my kitchen. The ovens were warm. The first loaves of the day were proofing under their linen cloths, and the air smelled the way it always did: yeast and flour, and the particular golden warmth that I had come to think of as the smell of my life. Crumpet was in his basket by the hearth. Antonio was somewhere in the castle, being kingly. The palace was quiet in that early morning way, before the staff arrived and the day began its inevitable acceleration. I was rolling out pastry when I felt it. Not a kick, not anything so definite. More like a shift in gravity, a warmth that wasn't the oven, a fullness that hadn't been there yesterday, or last week, or any of the long, careful, patient months before this one. My hands slowed, then stopped. I stood very still, one hand on the marble counter, the other drifting, almost without permission, to my stomach. I had felt this before, twice. Both times followed by the quiet, private grief of it not staying. I had learned not to trust the feeling. I had learned to wait, to not hope too loudly, to keep my hands busy and my expectations low. But this felt different. I didn't know how, I didn't know why, it just did. In his basket by the hearth, Crumpet lifted his head. He had been asleep. There was no noise, no change in the room, nothing that should have woken him. But his dark eyes were open and fixed on me with an intensity that didn't belong to a creature who had, 10 minutes earlier, been dreaming about glimmer moths. He stood up. He stepped out of his basket. He crossed the kitchen floor, not in his usual bouncing trot, but slowly, deliberately, with a seriousness that made him look, for just a moment, like something older and wiser than a wolf pup who still hadn't figured out how stairs worked. He stopped at my feet. He didn't sit on my foot. He didn't look up at me. He pressed his nose, gently, just once, against my belly. Then he pulled back, looked at me with those dark, knowing eyes, and returned to his basket. He circled twice, lay down, and went back to sleep. I stood in my flour-dusted kitchen, one hand on the counter, the other on my stomach, and the tears came before I could stop them. Not grief, not fear. Something bigger than both, and quieter, and so full of hope, it hurt. I didn't tell Antonio yet. I wasn't ready. I wanted to hold it for a moment, this fragile, impossible, ordinary thing, in the place where I was most myself. My kitchen, my flour, my bread, my small wolf sleeping by the fire. But I smiled, and the morning light came in through the windows, and the bread rose, and somewhere in the castle, a king who smelled like oatmeal soap was about to have the best day of his life, and he didn't even know it yet. We were home, all three of us, and soon, maybe, one more. 7 months later, our son arrived. He was born at 3 a.m, in our bedchamber, with a healer on one side and Antonio on the other, and Crumpet, who was no longer a pup, but a lean, leggy young wolf with ears that had never quite learned to stand at the same angle, stationed at the foot of the bed like a furry, self-appointed midwife. He had refused to leave. Antonio had tried to remove him twice. Both times, Crumpet had given him the look. The look that said, very clearly, "I was here first, I outrank you in all matters concerning this woman, and if you touch me, I will destroy something you love." Antonio, who had learned a great deal about choosing his battles over the past 7 months, let him stay. The baby was small and red and furious about the whole situation. He had his father's dark hair and my nose, and a cry that could shatter diplomatic relations at 50 paces. We named him Rowan. Crumpet took one look at him, and that was it. The absolute, unshakable, gravitational devotion that had once been reserved exclusively for me and my left foot simply expanded. It did not divide. It expanded. As if his heart, which I had always suspected was roughly 4 times the size his body could reasonably accommodate, had just been waiting for one more person to absorb. Within 24 hours, Crumpet had established the following rules regarding the Crown Prince of the Blackwood Pack, and he enforced them with the humorless intensity of a creature who had once peed on a king's squeaky toy and would absolutely do it again. Rule 1. Nobody touches the baby without Crumpet's explicit physical approval. This was granted via a thorough sniffing of the person's hands, followed by either a step aside, "You may proceed," or a low growl that translated roughly to "Absolutely not, you smell wrong, come back when you've reconsidered your life choices." The healer passed. The head chef passed. Marcus passed, but only on his 3rd attempt, after Crumpet subjected him to a full 2-minute olfactory audit that Marcus later described as professionally humiliating. Antonio, naturally, was subjected to the most rigorous screening process of all. Every single time. "I am his father," Antonio said, standing at the nursery door while Crumpet blocked his path with the calm authority of a border official who had seen this passport before and was not impressed. "I am the reason he exists." Crumpet sniffed his hand, sniffed his wrist, leaned in and sniffed the crook of his elbow, then sat down and stared at him. "I used the oatmeal soap. I always use the oatmeal soap. I have used nothing but oatmeal soap for 7 months, Crumpet. I smell like a baked good." Crumpet considered this. Then he stood, stepped aside exactly 12 inches, the minimum clearance required for Antonio's frame, and watched, with visible suspicion, as the alpha king of the Blackwood Pack entered his own son's nursery. "He's worse now," Antonio told me that evening, with the hollow stare of a man who had been security screened by a wolf 9 times in a single day. "He was bad with you. With Rowan, he is the Secret Service. He is a one-wolf government agency." "The security protocol is thorough," my wolf noted approvingly. "The the wolf, has established perimeter control over the air. His methodology is sound. I have no notes." Rule 2. Crumpet slept under the crib, not beside it, under it. He had claimed the space on day 1, circling 3 times and lying down with his nose pointed toward the door, as if daring the world to try something. He slept lightly, and any sound from the baby, a whimper, a cough, a particularly aggressive yawn, resulted in Crumpet's head appearing over the edge of the crib like a furry periscope, assessing the situation with the grave intensity of a field commander. If the sound was nothing, he went back to sleep. If the sound was actual distress, he came to find me. Not Antonio, me. Always me. He would trot to wherever I was, press his nose against my hand, and lead me back to the nursery with the clear implication that I had been neglecting my duties by briefly existing in a different room. "He doesn't come to me," Antonio said one night, watching Crumpet escort me down the corridor at 2 in the morning. "The baby is crying and he fetches you. Like I'm not standing right there. Like I'm furniture." "Familiar feeling?" I asked sweetly. He groaned. "History is repeating itself. I've been demoted again." Rule 3, and this was the one that broke Marcus's composure and nearly broke the palace. Crumpet had opinions about who could hold the baby, and those opinions were non-negotiable. The visiting ambassador from the River Pack, a perfectly dignified woman with 30 years of diplomatic experience, reached for Rowan during a formal reception. Crumpet, who had been lying quietly under the bassinet, so quietly that the ambassador had not registered his existence, rose to his full height, which was now considerable, positioned himself between the ambassador and the baby, and emitted a growl that was no longer a bee in a thimble. It was a full, resonant, deeply authoritative sound that silenced the entire reception hall. The ambassador withdrew her hands. "Your wolf," she said carefully, "appears to have a security clearance system." "He does," I confirmed. "You'll need to submit to a scent check. Both hands, both wrists. He's thorough." She looked at Crumpet. Crumpet looked at her. The moment stretched. "I have negotiated treaties with hostile packs," the ambassador said. "I have brokered peace between blood-feuding alphas. I have never been assessed by a wolf for the privilege of holding a baby." "First time for everything," Marcus offered from the corner, where he was already, incredibly, inevitably, making notations in a new ledger. The ambassador submitted to the sniffing. She passed. She held Rowan for exactly 4 minutes before Crumpet decided that was sufficient and gently herded her away from the bassinet with his body. Later, after the reception, I found Antonio in the kitchen. He was sitting on the floor with his back against the prep table, Rowan asleep on his chest, and Crumpet lying across his feet. His feet. I stopped in the doorway. "Is he sitting on your feet?" Antonio looked down at the wolf draped across his boots, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. "He does this now, only when I'm holding Rowan. I think it's his version of supervised contact." Crumpet opened one eye, confirmed that the baby was still breathing, and that Antonio had not done anything objectionable in the last 30 seconds, and closed it again. "He still doesn't fully trust me," Antonio said, but he was smiling. "But he trusts me with Rowan, in a supervised capacity, with conditions." Assessment. "The Alpha has been granted provisional custody privileges within the family unit," my wolf observed. The wolf's supervision is a reasonable precaution given the Alpha's historically chaotic courtship of the pack. Approval rating. Improving. Slowly. I sat down beside them. Rowan made a small, perfect sound in his sleep. Not a cry, just a noise. The kind babies make when they are warm and full and have no idea that the world contains anything other than the people holding them. Crumpet's ear twitched at the sound, processing it, filing it away in whatever internal system he used to catalog the noises of the people he'd claimed. 4 of us now. In a kitchen that smelled like bread and oatmeal soap, with a wolf on our feet and a baby on our chest, and the morning still hours away. "He's going to be impossible when Rowan starts walking, isn't he?" Antonio said. "He's going to be a nightmare," I confirmed. "He will follow that child like a shadow. He will growl at every person who comes within 3 feet. He will bring you Rowan's socks as trophies and deposit them in front of the Council of Elders. The Council has barely recovered from the last time. The Council will never recover. The Council has accepted its fate." Antonio kissed the top of Rowan's head, then leaned over and kissed mine. From across his feet, a low growl, familiar, token, almost affectionate at this point, rumbled through the kitchen. "Still on probation?" he asked. "Forever," I said, "but he lets me keep you." Antonio wrapped his free arm around me, pulling me into the warm, bread-scented, wolf-guarded circle of our family. His wolf sent out a pulse of pure contentment. My wolf noted, "The pack is complete. The air is secured. The wolf's perimeter is holding. All systems nominal." And Crumpet, draped across the feet of a king he had once terrorized with a single symbolic stream of pee, let out a long, satisfied sigh and went to sleep. We were home, all 4 of us, and the kingdom, somehow, was still standing.